Daniel Carter used to believe that rock bottom was the day his wife walked out leaving him with a toddler, a broken heart, and a stack of unpaid bills high enough to bury them both. But standing at the altar in a polyester suit that smelled of mothballs, looking down at a billionaire heiress confined to a wheelchair, he realized he hadn't known the true meaning of shame until this moment. The pews were buzzing with hushed judgment, everyone convinced he had auctioned off his soul for a blank check. His relatives framed it as a survival strategy. But when the officiant started speaking, the bride abruptly rose from her chair, delivering a single sentence that sucked the air right out of the room. It begged the question who was truly the one on trial that afternoon. 3 months prior to the nuptials, Daniel sat at his chipped kitchen table, eyes locked on the red lettering of an eviction warning. The flimsy sheet of paper weighed a ton in his hands. Silence filled the cramped apartment, broken only by the dying refrigerator's rattle and the groan of settling floorboards. Lucas was passed out in the bedroom. Daniel had waited for the boy's breathing to even out before tearing the envelope open. 38 years on this earth, and he had absolutely nothing to show for it. The split had hollowed him out. 2 years back, his ex bolted with a new man, leaving Daniel to raise their son alone, while drowning in the financial wreckage she left behind. The sedan had been repossessed. The savings account was drained dry. He pawned his wedding band months ago just to keep the lights on, leaving him with nothing but a 7-year-old boy who still asked why Mommy wasn't coming home for dinner. Daniel creased the document and tossed it onto the Formica. He had exactly 2 weeks to scrape together $3,000, or they would be sleeping on a park bench. He had already tapped out every favor and friend he had. His warehouse wages barely put groceries in the fridge, let alone covered back rent. The well was dry, and he had known it for weeks. Then, as the sun rose the next morning, his phone buzzed with a call from his mother. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She stopped caring about "how are you" long ago. Her tone was transactional and cold, the voice she reserved for business and bad news. She summoned him to her place for the afternoon, claiming she had something urgent to discuss. Daniel said yes, mostly because he was too beaten down to put up a fight. When he walked in, he found her in the living room, flanked by his older brother. Tom, a construction foreman, had always been the golden child who held the family together. The look on Tom's face was shifting and awkward, a sure sign that whatever was coming was going to be ugly. His mother pointed to the armchair. He sat. She wasted no time on small talk. There was a woman filthy rich. She resided just beyond the city limits in the kind of gated fortress usually reserved for Architectural Digest spreads. Her name was Olivia Bennett. The name meant nothing to Daniel, but his mother insisted his ignorance was irrelevant. The only relevant fact was that Olivia was in the market for a spouse. She was 35, single, and confined to a wheelchair following a wreck a few years back. That was the extent of their intel. Olivia was a ghost, no tabloids, no galas, just immense wealth and total seclusion. Daniel looked at his mother like she had grown a second head. He asked if this was a joke. Her stone-faced expression confirmed it wasn't. Tom squirmed in his chair but kept his mouth shut while their mother pressed on, explaining that a mutual contact had brokered the idea. Olivia needed a rock someone steady who wouldn't tuck tail and run when things got complicated. Daniel fit the profile. The deal was simple: meet her charm, her, and secure a marriage license. In exchange, the cash would flow. Lucas's future would be secured, and the debt collectors would vanish. Daniel shot out of his chair. The answer was a hard no. He wasn't about to prostitute himself into a marriage with a stranger just for a payout. He called the whole scheme degrading. His mother didn't yell. She just calmly asked what his alternative strategy looked like. She asked how he planned to keep a roof over Lucas's head, wondering aloud if his precious pride was accepted as legal tender by the landlord. Daniel stormed out without a word, driving back to his crumbling apartment in a desperate attempt to scrub the conversation from his mind. But reality hit that evening when Lucas wandered into the kitchen while Daniel was agonizing over the ledger, clutching a crumbled permission slip. The fee was $40. Lucas asked if they had the money, quickly adding that it was totally fine if they didn't. He claimed he understood, but as Daniel looked at the boy, it broke him to see a 7-year-old already trained to expect disappointment. The excursion was a day trip to the City Science Museum. That was Lucas's whole world. He spent hours rambling about astronauts, orbital mechanics, and the inner workings of machines. The kid deserved to go. He deserved a hell of a lot more than a leaking apartment and a dad who couldn't scrape together $40. The following morning, Daniel dialed his mother. He agreed to the meeting. She didn't sound the least bit shocked. She rattled off an address and a time slot, telling him to clean himself up and look respectable. Daniel killed the call and sat frozen in the driver's seat for an eternity before heading home. The appointment was booked for the upcoming Saturday. Daniel snagged a button-down from Tom and made the drive to the outskirts. The estate was a monstrosity tucked behind wrought iron gates at the end of a long, tree-lined approach. Daniel had never set foot in a zip code like this. His battered sedan seemed to shrink in shame before he even killed the engine. The door was opened by a steel-spined woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Mrs. Lawson, the personal assistant. She marched him down a corridor where the floors shone like ice, and the art on the walls probably cost more than his entire life's earnings. The air smelled of money, sterile and freezing. Finally, they arrived at a drawing room where Olivia sat confined to a wheelchair exactly as the family gossip had described. Her dark hair was scraped back severely, and despite the simple blouse and trousers, she radiated an aura of untouchable distance that made her impossible to read. A flick of her hand indicated a chair, and as Daniel sank into it, Mrs. Lawson exited the heavy door clicking shut to seal them in. Olivia skipped the pleasantries entirely, cutting straight to the bone. "Why are you here?" He didn't bother varnishing the truth. He was broke, he had a boy to feed, and he admitted his relatives had brokered this introduction because he was out of options. She absorbed every word in silence, then fixed him with a cool stare, asking, "Are you looking for my pity?" "No," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "I don't expect a thing." She scrutinized him for a long beat, gauging his worth before asking, "Do you actually grasp the nature of this deal?" She made it clear she wasn't in the market for romance or a soulmate. She needed a fixture, someone who wouldn't bail the second life got messy. Most suitors, she noted dryly, only saw the bank account and ignored the human attached to it. She was vetting him for a different quality, though she didn't specify what, leading Daniel to ask, "Why even consider a guy like me?" "I haven't chosen anyone," she corrected him. "This is an audition. The question is, are you prepared to play the part?" Daniel's mind flashed to Lucas, then to the neon orange eviction sticker plastered on their front door. He remembered the $40 school trip he couldn't afford and said yes. Olivia informed him they'd reconvene in 2 weeks if she decided he was worth a second look. He gave a curt nod and walked out, but driving away a sick feeling settled in his gut like he had pawned off a piece of his soul he would never see again. Round 2 was brief. Olivia turned the spotlight immediately to Lucas. She probed into the wreckage of his marriage and demanded to know his ambitions for the boy, to which Daniel gave the unvarnished truth. He told her he just wanted a fair shot for the kid, a life where Lucas didn't have to learn the crushing math of survival before he learned long division. Olivia offered zero emotional feedback, simply thanking him and promising to be in contact. Mrs. Lawson rang a week later with the verdict Olivia had made her choice, and the deal was on. The ceremony was set for 2 months out, contingent of course on an ironclad prenup. There would be no signing bonus, but if the union endured Lucas's tuition, and their housing would be fully underwritten. If the marriage failed, Daniel would walk away with empty pockets. Mrs. Lawson paused to ask, "Do you accept these terms?" Daniel agreed, but breaking the news to Lucas that evening was harder. The boy looked puzzled and asked the one question Daniel feared, "Do you love her, Dad?" "It's complicated," Daniel mumbled, but Lucas pivoted instantly to the important stuff. "Are we moving into the mansion?" When Daniel said yes, the kid lit up, and seeing that joy was a relief and a dagger to the heart all at once. The extended family, however, was a mixed bag. His mom breathed a sigh of relief that the financial bleeding would stop, while Tom raised an eyebrow but promised to have his back. Some cousins cracked wise about Daniel hitting the jackpot, but nobody bothered to ask how he really felt about selling himself to keep the lights on. The countdown to the wedding was surreal. Olivia remained a ghost in her own narrative. No calls, no visits. Everything was filtered through Mrs. Lawson, while Daniel signed stacks of legal documents that might as well have been in Greek. A slick attorney walked him through the agreement, making it crystal clear that Daniel wouldn't see a dime of her empire unless he jumped through every hoop. He didn't even blink before signing. You can't lose what you never had. As the big day loomed, Lucas's interrogation intensified. He desperately wanted to know if she liked dinosaurs. "Will she read to me at night?" Daniel didn't have the heart to say he didn't know, so he lied and said she was very kind and just wanted to see them smile. He had no idea if any of that was true, and the night before the ceremony, sleep was impossible. Staring into the dark, he was haunted by the memory of his ex-wife's face, the sheer contempt in her eyes right before she walked out. His mind replayed this reel of his failures, the dead-end warehouse gig, the eviction threats, the field trip fee he couldn't scrape together. Then his thoughts drifted to Olivia, stoic, silent, unreachable, and he wondered if she just saw another desperate loser at the end of his rope. At dawn, Daniel dragged himself up and donned the bargain bin suit Tom had picked up for him. It hung off him all wrong, the polyester stiff and scratchy, and when he checked the mirror, he saw a stranger's eyes looking back. Lucas bounced into the room grinning in his own miniature formal wear. The boy told him he looked handsome, but Daniel didn't feel handsome. He felt like a condemned man walking the last mile toward a fate he couldn't outrun. The news didn't just travel, it burned through the grapevine. His mother whispered it to a couple of aunts, thinking she was being discreet. Then Tom let it slip on the shop floor. Before the week was out, the whole town had the scoop. Daniel Carter. The guy who couldn't hold on to a marriage or a savings account was hitching his wagon to a disabled heiress. The backlash arrived right on schedule. Mrs. Brennan caught him in the corridor one night. She used to be the sweet old lady who offered cookies, but that version of her was gone. She fixed him with a look that hovered somewhere between sorrow and disgust, muttering about how she prayed he understood the consequences. The way she said it implied he was walking blind off a cliff. He gave a curt nod and kept moving toward his apartment. As the key turned in the lock, her hushed voice drifted over. He caught the important bit's desperate, sad bot. The warehouse floor was even less forgiving. He had been punching the clock there for nearly 12 months. It wasn't a career, but it paid the bills. Everyone knew he was drowning in debt and divorce papers. They used to slap him on the back with pity, but that camaraderie evaporated the second the engagement news broke. Rick, a guy who liked the sound of his own voice, trapped him by the vending machines during lunch. He leaned back, arms folded across his chest, and asked what it felt like to throw in the towel on being a man. Daniel muttered something about keeping his nose out of it. Rick just chuckled, announcing that selling your pride in broad daylight made it everyone's concern. A small crowd started to gather. A few guys shifted their weight awkwardly, but plenty of heads bobbed in agreement. Rick claimed he was setting a dangerous precedent. "Real men earn their keep," he sneered. "They don't look for a sugar mama." Daniel turned on his heel before he did something that would get him fired. 7 days later, a printout appeared, taped to his locker door some tabloid piece about gold-digging husbands. A thick red line circled a section on self-worth with the word parasite, highlighted in neon yellow. He crumpled it into the ball and tossed it. Complaining wouldn't change a thing. At least Lucas offered a reprieve from the noise. The kid was oblivious to the gossip and the judgmental glares. He just saw a big adventure and a bigger bedroom. All he cared about was green grass to run on and whether the new lady owned a puppy. Daniel fielded the questions as gently as possible. He tried to build a wall around the boy, but playground chatter is pervasive. One afternoon, Lucas walked in with his shoulders slumped. When pressed, the boy admitted a friend said his dad was getting married because he wasn't strong enough to support them alone. Daniel clenched his teeth until his jaw ached. He knelt down and asked if Lucas thought it was true. The boy shook his head, but his eyes held a shadow of doubt. Daniel got down on the floor to look him square in the face. He explained that grown-ups sometimes have to take difficult paths to keep their family safe, but that doesn't make them bad people. Lucas absorbed this slowly before asking the killer question. Did he love her? Daniel admitted they were basically strangers. The kid took it in stride better than the grown-ups anyway. The family gatherings were an entirely different kind of torture. His mom threw a dinner party a few weeks out. Every distant relation came out of the woodwork. The tiny living room was packed with cousins and uncles, the air thick with chatter and judgment. People who hadn't called in years were suddenly fascinated by his existence, demanding specs on the mansion. They wanted to know her net worth and if he had signed his rights away. He confirmed the prenuptial agreement with a nod. Cousin Janet cackled, saying at least he wasn't pretending it was a romance. Tom was the only one who dragged him away from the vultures. They retreated to the patch of grass out back. Tom sparked a cigarette and held out the pack. Daniel waved it off. Tom took a long drag, letting the silence hang heavy between them. Finally, he admitted he got it. Said he would probably make the same play if he was in Daniel's shoes. But he warned him not to be naive. The world wasn't going to let him forget he was a kept man. "I'm already living it," Daniel replied. Tom nodded, flicking gray ash onto the lawn. He told Daniel to watch his back with Olivia. People with that kind of money don't make moves without an angle. If she was buying a husband, she expected a return on investment. Daniel said he was well aware. Tom didn't look convinced. As for the bride-to-be, she was a ghost. Daniel only laid eyes on her twice after the deal was struck. The encounters were colder than a business merger. The first was just a logistics check for the big day. She sat in her wheelchair, positioned in the exact spot where they had first crossed paths. Mrs. Lawson stood by scribbling on a pad. Olivia asked if he had any demands for the nuptials. He told her to do whatever she wanted. She declared it would be a quiet affair. He nodded. Then she asked about the boy. Daniel confirmed Lucas would be there. She gave a single sharp nod. That was it. The next time they met, things got weird. When the invitation to dine at the manor arrived, Daniel allowed himself a flicker of hope for intimacy a moment without the housekeeper or legal counsel hovering. Instead of a warm reception, he walked into a cavernous dining room set for a solitary guest. The mistress of the house was nowhere to be found. Mrs. Lawson appeared with a practiced apology stating that business had pulled Olivia away, though she insisted Daniel make himself at home. The housekeeper encouraged him to eat and roam the grounds at his leisure, leaving Daniel to pick at a gourmet meal that might as well have been cardboard. He wandered through the pristine museum-quality halls afterward, finding them cold and devoid of life, eventually departing without catching a single glimpse of his fiancée. Paranoia began to set in. He wondered if this was some sort of twisted assessment of his character, though the criteria for passing remained a mystery. Olivia offered no comfort, no verbal assurances to soften the ironclad terms etched into their prenuptial contract. The legal language was brutal in its simplicity. If Daniel walked away within the first 12 months, he would leave with empty pockets. However, if he endured, Lucas's tuition would be secured and they would have a roof over their heads. Though Olivia's fortune would remain strictly her own. Daniel was legally barred from touching a cent of it, a clause he accepted only because he held 0 bargaining chips, yet the absence of security ate away at his resolve. Darker thoughts plagued him. What if she had a change of heart, or worse, what if this entire arrangement was an elaborate exercise in humiliating him? He tried to blockade those fears, forcing his mind to center solely on his son and the sheer necessity of surviving one day at a time. Yet in the heavy silence between the noise of life, the uncertainty always managed to seep back in. In the dead of night, with Lucas sound asleep and the apartment still, Daniel would hunch over the kitchen table, questioning if he was nothing more than Olivia's pet project. He questioned if she possessed the capacity for emotion at all. 21 days before the ceremony, the phone rang. It was Mr. Hayes, the attorney orchestrating the prenup, requesting Daniel's immediate presence at his firm. Assuming it was merely administrative housekeeping, Daniel went only to have Hayes sit him down and slide a fresh stack of paper across the mahogany desk. The lawyer explained with professional detachment that Olivia's extended clan had demanded further stipulations. The family required absolute certainty that Daniel would never challenge the contract or seek alimony should the union dissolve. They wanted him to waive rights he didn't even know he had. Daniel scanned the legalese, realizing quickly that this addendum was far more draconian than the original agreement. He was to be completely walled off from her accounts and decision-making processes. A divorce would see him ejected from that world with nothing but the shirt on his back. 0 assets. Mr. Hayes paused, peering over his spectacles to ask if Daniel wished to lodge a formal objection. Daniel met the attorney's gaze and asked if this cruelty had been Olivia's idea, to which Hayes clarified it was a mandate from the family trust, not the bride herself. Still, Olivia hadn't fought it. Daniel reached for the pen and signed his name with a steady hand, offering no resistance. Hayes blinked visibly, taken aback by the lack of fight, and asked if Daniel needed a moment to reconsider, but Daniel declined, stating his path was already chosen. If the dynasty wanted to build a fortress around their gold, that was their prerogative. Daniel wasn't there to plunder their vaults. He was there because the world had cornered him. The lawyer filed the document with a sense of finality, and Daniel walked out of the high-rise feeling more hollow than he had when he entered. The final 7 days leading up to the wedding were a gauntlet of social judgment, the quiet murmurs of the town turning into audible scoffs. While navigating the aisles of the local market, a woman from his former congregation made a remark clearly intended for his ears. She announced to her companion that it was tragic to see a man sell his dignity, and the two of them swept past Daniel as if he were invisible. He completed his errands in a daze, only to face Lucas back home, who wanted to know why the neighbors were looking at them so strangely. Daniel struggled for a response, eventually telling the boy that people often fear or misjudge decisions they cannot comprehend. When Lucas asked if the opinions of others mattered, Daniel admitted that while he fought to ignore them, the judgment stung more than he cared to confess. On the eve of the ceremony, Daniel and Lucas sat amidst cardboard boxes in their fading living room, packing the remnants of their old life. The bulk of their possessions were destined for a storage unit, as Olivia had instructed them to bring only the bare essentials to the estate. Unsure of how to interpret that command, Daniel packed clothing for the boy and a small selection of books. For himself, he took only his wardrobe and a handful of photographs, deeming everything else expendable. Lucas unearthed a dusty snapshot of Daniel and his ex-wife captured years ago in a timeline before their world collapsed. They looked happy in the photo. Lucas held it up, asking if his father missed her, to which Daniel said no, prompting the boy to ask if he was afraid of the wedding. Daniel admitted he was terrified, and Lucas climbed onto his lap, wrapping small arms around him and whispering that everything would be fine. Daniel held his son close, desperate to believe the child's optimism. Later, in the solitude of the bathroom, he confronted his reflection. The man in the mirror looked far beyond 38. Anxiety had etched deep ravines into his skin, and his eyes were dull with exhaustion. He thought of the person he once was, the idealist who believed that grit and honest labor were enough to build a future. That man had ceased to exist. All that remained was a desperate father willing to barter his life to keep his son from starving. Olivia was still a stranger despite the 2 months he'd spent preparing for this union. She was an ice queen, remote, opaque, and utterly unreadable. Her reasons for signing off on this transaction were a mystery he hadn't cracked. Perhaps it was pity. Maybe she was just lonely. Or she was running some private experiment he couldn't see. Daniel felt like a rounding error in an equation he didn't understand. The ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock sharp. Sleep refused to come. He lay there, eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling tuned into the nightly rhythm of the tenement. The fridge rattled in the corner. Tires crunched on the gravel outside. Faint TV static drifted through the thin walls from a neighbor's unit. The soundtrack of the working poor. By sunup, he'd be trading it all for a silence he couldn't afford. Dawn dragged its feet. Daniel dragged himself out of bed, scrubbed himself raw, and wrestled into the bargain bin suit Tom had scavenged. The fabric bunched in all the wrong places. He roused Lucas, guiding sleepy limbs into miniature formal wear. The kid was groggy but buzzing with energy. "We really moving to the mansion, Dad?" Daniel nodded. Lucas beamed. The drive to the venue was heavy with unsaid words. He kept a firm grip on the steering wheel, masking the panic spiraling behind his eyes. He catalogued every potential disaster, the ironclad prenup, the glacial indifference in Olivia's gaze. He could practically hear the gossip mongers sharpening their knives. Gold digger. Charity case. The parasite attached to the host. By the time they pulled up, the stage was already set. Stark, just as she'd insisted. A handful of folding chairs, a bare podium. Zero fanfare. Zero romance. His mom and Tom huddled together. A scattering of strangers occupied the back row, witnesses he'd never met, judging from the shadows. The wedding planner stood sentry at the door, reviewing her clipboard. She acknowledged him with a curt professional nod. Olivia was waiting. Her white dress was simple, expensive, and impeccable. She sat in her chair at the head of the aisle, radiating a calm that bordered on supernatural. She didn't spare him a glance. He marched down the makeshift aisle, Lucas sticking close to his leg. Lucas offered a shy wave. Olivia dipped her chin, the barest acknowledgement. Daniel stepped up to the block. The officiant, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, murmured a greeting and cracked open his ledger. A hush smothered the room. The weight of their scrutiny was physical. His mother beamed with relief. Tom looked ready to snap. Behind him, the gallery of strangers murmured, assessing the merchandise. Daniel stared strictly ahead, refusing to engage. The officiant started his spiel about eternal bonds and shared burdens. It sounded like a script for two other people. Daniel stood rigid, lungs tight, tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth, the point of no return. The man turned to the bride, prompting her for the vows. That's when she gripped the armrests, braced herself, and simply rose. The atmosphere evaporated. It wasn't the hush of reverence. It was the vacuum left when reality fractures. Olivia towered over the chrome frame. She no longer required the white silk of her dress falling straight. No trembling, no struggle. She stood with the poise of someone who had never needed that chair a day in her life. Air snagged in Daniel's throat. His brain stalled, unable to reconcile the image. The invalid, the helpless heiress. The woman whose disability was the only reason society excused a pauper like him marrying her. She was standing tall. It was a lie. A sharp gasp cut the air behind him, his mother sounding scandalized. Tom cursed softly. Lucas yanked on Daniel's jacket, whispering a confused question that nobody heard. Daniel was a statue, frozen. He just watched as she stepped around the obstruction and squared up to him. Her face remained a mask, but the eyes were different now. The ice had cracked, revealing something sharper underneath. She studied him like a scientist examining a lab rat that had successfully navigated a maze. The officiant stood paralyzed, liturgy forgotten, glancing frantically between the standing bride and the stunned groom. Olivia broke the spell. Her tone was crystal clear, slicing through the tension like a razor. She announced that an explanation was due specifically to the man beside her. The disability was a fabrication. The chair was a prop, a litmus test. She let that sink in, watching him process the betrayal. She was tired, she explained, of suitors who looked at her and saw only a bank account with a pulse. Smooth talkers with bright smiles selling dreams they never planned to deliver. The type who would slip a ring on her finger just to get the passcode to her portfolio, then vanish. The second things got real. She knew better than to trust a pretty sentiment. Life had taught her a brutal lesson: people only lie when the payout is big enough to justify the sin. Olivia pivoted, addressing the crowded room, though her gaze remained locked on Daniel like a sniper's scope. The wheelchair, she confessed, wasn't a tragedy. It was a sieve designed to filter out the actors. If a man stepped up to the altar thinking he was signing on for a life of burden with nothing but cash to sweeten the deal, then perhaps, just perhaps, he wasn't a shark. Maybe he was the real thing. A cocktail of emotions churned in Daniel's gut: fury, shame, and a sickening wash of relief. He couldn't tell which one was driving the nausea. For 2 months he had been the main attraction in a circus of judgment. He had signed away his dignity, ignored the snickers in the hallway, and let them call him a gold digger because he believed the sacrifice was necessary. And the whole time it was just a dress rehearsal, a psychological experiment. Olivia had been the scientist behind the glass, observing him, grading him against a rubric he didn't even know he was failing or passing. She stared at him now, admitting she knew exactly what the whispers said. She knew every slur, every accusation, every dirty name the town had thrown at him. And she had let the mud stick just to see if he would wipe it off or wear it. She had to know if he would bolt, if he would demand insurance, or if he would try to leverage her vulnerability to secure a payout before the vows were even exchanged. Daniel hadn't played that game. He had signed that ironclad prenuptial agreement without a single objection. He swallowed every draconian clause her family threw at him, asked for 0 amendments, and when her lawyer offered him an exit ramp, he stayed in his lane. To Olivia, that silence spoke louder than any vow. She noted that 99% of men in his shoes would have carved out a safety net. They would have demanded a signing bonus or a golden parachute in the contract. They would have made sure their time wasn't being wasted for free. But not Daniel. He walked into the lion's den with empty pockets, fully accepting he might be thrown out with even less. That kind of reckless integrity was endangered. That was something you didn't ignore. Daniel's fist tightened until his knuckles turned white. He opened his mouth, but the indignation choked him. He felt flayed open, as if his late-night panic attacks and private desperation were suddenly public property. Olivia had scripted the whole nightmare. The icy distance, the silence, the formal barrier between them, it wasn't her personality, it was her exam. And he had been the unwitting student. His mother shot up from the back row, trembling with rage. She declared this a disgrace, shouting that Olivia had dragged their family name through the dirt for sport. Tom tried to restrain her, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged him off like an annoying fly. She demanded to know what kind of monster plays God with human lives. Olivia didn't even blink. The kind of person, Olivia replied calmly, who is tired of being the prey. She had built a fortress the only way she knew how. If that made her a villain in their story, she would wear the black hat. But she refused to apologize for vetting a partner before handing them the keys to her existence. Daniel finally cut through the tension. He told her she could have just asked. She could have offered him the truth instead of a trap. She could have spared him 60 days of being looked at like a parasite, or worse. He told her he ate that humiliation because he felt cornered. Because he convinced himself he was doing what had to be done for his son's future. Olivia held his gaze unyielding. That she insisted was precisely why he passed. He wasn't enduring it for his own gain. Every other suitor had looked at her and seen an ATM. Daniel had looked at the situation and seen a job that needed doing. That distinction puts food on the table, Daniel countered, shaking his head. It's easy for you to talk about tests when you hold the whip. She had the capital, the safety net, the control. He was walking a tightrope without a net. He pointed out that she backed him into a corner where yes was the only survival option, and then she judged him for saying it. He asked her if that sounded like justice. Olivia didn't fire back immediately. She studied his face, and the steel in her eyes softened just a fraction. It wasn't quite an apology, but the arrogance faded. She admitted it wasn't fair, but fairness wasn't the objective. Survival was. She was trying to keep the wolves at the door, and she knew she had bruised him in the process. She owned that damage. But she refused to regret getting the answer she needed. Then she lowered her voice, stripping away the audience. She asked him point-blank did he marry her for the check or because he decided to honor the deal. She said she knew desperation signed the paper, but she needed to know what kept him standing there. She wasn't born yesterday. She just needed to know if he ever looked in the mirror and truly assessed his own character. Amidst the chaos, the rage evaporated from Daniel's chest, leaving a leaden weight in its place. His mind drifted to the nights he spent staring at the ceiling, terrified he was making a fatal error. He recalled the scratch of the pen on the prenuptial agreement, the distinct sensation of selling off the last scrap of his autonomy. He remembered Lucas asking if this was real love, and the crushing silence Daniel had offered in return. So he gave it to her straight. He walked down this aisle because he was out of options. He admitted it was about survival, keeping his boy safe and fed and in a decent school. He refused to dress it up as a fairy tale. Yet he made it clear once he shook hands on the deal he wasn't going to back out. He hadn't tried to hustle her or squeeze an extra dime out of the contract beyond what was on the table. He forfeited his rights to prove, if only to himself, that he could keep his integrity even while losing his shirt. This wasn't about acing some character exam. It was just a man trying not to drown while keeping his head above water. If that passed her inspection, great. But she needed to understand the toll it took. There was no glory in it. It was gut-wrenching, degrading, and the hardest shift he had ever worked. Olivia took it all in silent as a statue before giving a slow, deliberate nod. She bought it. That was exactly why she halted the ceremony, because he deserved to know his integrity actually counted for something. She confessed she had been observing him like a hawk for 2 months. She watched him offer deference to Mrs. Lawson, maintaining his manners even when he felt out of place. She noticed that every conversation eventually circled back to his son's well-being. She watched him sign away a fortune without flinching or negotiating for a safety net. He stood tall while people looked down their noses at him. Olivia noted that most men only play nice when there is a profit margin. Daniel stayed steady when there was zero payout. That set him apart. That was the quality she needed. She faced the minister and signaled they could proceed if Daniel was still on board. The ball was in his court. She had already decided to see this through 2 months ago. But if he wanted to cut and run, she wouldn't blame him. She knew she had dragged him through the mud. Daniel scanned her face, then glanced down at Lucas, whose eyes were wide with childhood confusion. He checked on Tom, who offered a stoic nod, and his mother, who looked torn between outrage and a sigh of relief. He swept his gaze over the spectators in the back, the gossips, and found their opinions suddenly held no weight. Locking eyes with Olivia, he told her he wasn't going anywhere. He made a promise, and he intended to honor it. Not for her bank account, and not because he won her game, but because he carved this path and he would walk it. He was exhausted from dodging life's curveballs and feeling like a passenger in his own existence. This was the one variable he could manage his own word. The steel in Olivia's posture melted. It was the first time the armor truly dropped. That was the only assurance she required. She held out a hand, and he didn't hesitate to grip it. Her handshake was solid and warm. She promised they would navigate the chaos as a team. The minister coughed nervously, asking if the drama was over. They both assented. The ceremony sprinted to the finish line, the officiant racing through the liturgy before another objection could arise. When the marriage was pronounced, the room stayed dead quiet, no cheering, just thick tension. The couple stood their ground. She released his hand but stayed right in his orbit. Lucas tugged at her dress, asking if she was all right. She flashed the boy a genuine, unguarded grin. That appeased the kid, but Daniel's mother walked up looking shaken. She admitted she couldn't wrap her head around the spectacle. Olivia nodded, hoping time would smooth out the edges. The older woman didn't reply. She just grabbed her grandson and steered him toward the exit. Tom gave his brother a firm squeeze on the shoulder, promised to ring him up later, and trailed their mother. The gallery of strangers filtered out in hushed tones, keeping their judgments to themselves. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the metallic click of Mrs. Lawson collapsing the wheelchair. Her face was a mask of professional indifference typical of those who serve the elite. She did not bat an eye at the deception. Watching her, Daniel felt a cold certainty that the staff always knew the family's secrets long before the punchline landed. Olivia finally pivoted toward him, her demeanor shifting from performance to negotiation. "We need to talk," she stated, her voice low. "Not here, but soon." She spoke of drafting a new constitution for their union, setting boundaries and managing expectations. This marriage was legally binding, she reasoned, but they were not required to mimic the hollow arrangements of her social circle. We write the rules ourselves, she insisted. Daniel nodded slowly. In a life where he rarely held the pen, that proposition sounded more than fair. A genuine softness returned to her features, a rare, fleeting smile. I actually think, she ventured, that we might survive this without killing each other. I hope so, Daniel replied, the gravity of his situation cutting through the moment. Unlike her, he had no safety net to catch him if this high-wire act failed. This was his only shot. They exited the ceremony hall side by side, leaving the folded wheelchair in the corner a discarded prop from a cruel little morality play. The afternoon sun hit them with unforgiving clarity the moment they stepped outside. Daniel narrowed his eyes against the glare, his mind still reeling from the sudden shift in reality. He had been an unwitting participant in a character test. The wealthy had appraised him like an antique, measured his moral fiber, and surprisingly deemed him authentic. The indignity of it sat heavy in his chest. Yet standing there with an heiress on his arm and a uniformed driver holding the door, a realization took root. He had not sold his soul to get there. Faced with an impossible bind, he had made his choice based on who he was, not what he stood to gain. That kind of integrity had to carry weight. In fact, it might be the only thing that truly mattered. Ready? Olivia asked, searching his eyes for hesitation. Ready, Daniel confirmed. They slid into the car, the engine purring as it carried them toward the estate and the unknown territory ahead. A person's value is not found in their bank balance or their lineage, Daniel mused as the gates closed behind them. It is measured by how steady they stand when the world kicks the crutches away and leaves them with nothing but their own backbone.